Hi and welcome back to the photographycourse.net YouTube channel. In this video I'd like to share some camera tips and techniques for street photography. So all of these tips are going to be about camera techniques and things that you can do with your camera to be able to use it better. And do keep watching until the end because there's a real gem of a tip at the end that I'd like to share with you. One of the key things to being a good and confident street photographer is being confident with the gear that you use. So whatever camera you're using, whatever lenses you're using, if you can use them as easily as possible without paying too much attention to them, then you'll be able to pay more attention to your subject and the light and composition and everything else. You can learn to use your camera gear really well, and doing this will free you up to be a better photographer. And one of the key things in learning to use your gear well is to use minimal equipment. In the other video I posted about street photography techniques, I suggested not taking too much gear with you. The other benefit of this is that it's easier to get to know one camera and one lens. And for me personally, I like a prime lens. This is my 35mm f1.4. It's often on my camera because I love using it, and because of that I'm very familiar with it. I know distance ratios of how far away I need to be and what I'll be able to capture within my frame when I'm a metre away or 2 metres away. I'll also just get a feel for the amount of depth of field that I'm going to have when I'm set at maybe f4 or at f5.6 or even at f1.4, and depending on the distance. So this is one of the big benefits of working with minimal equipment, is that you can get a feel for it, and therefore your mind doesn't have to be concentrating on it. You're not going to be looking down at your camera and checking your settings so much, because you'll be able to just do it more naturally and more subconsciously. So it goes for the camera body as well. This is something that is really important. I use mainly one camera, and it's a very old camera. It's now, my D800's probably 8.5 years old now, and because of that I'm really familiar with it. It fits well in my hand, I know it really well, and I can use it without really taking too much attention or giving too much attention to it when I'm working. Sure, I've got to be aware of my settings. I use manual mode all of the time, so it's a matter of checking and looking, but in doing that it's really helpful that I've used this camera so much, because I'm so familiar with it, and then it just makes it easier to use. And with anything, the more you practice it, the better you'll get. So practicing with the same camera and the same lens is going to help you capture those moments when they happen. You're going to be looking, you're going to be observing what's happening around about you, rather than looking at your camera and trying to figure out what sort of settings are going to be. So that's the first tip in this video, is to know your camera gear well, and then the second part of that tip is to use minimal equipment so that you can get to know it easier than if you're changing lenses frequently or switching bodies or changing settings because you're not sure if one's going to be better than another. The more you practice, the more you focus on the minimal equipment that you're using, the better you'll be using it, and the better pictures you'll get because of it, and the more you'll enjoy it as well. So the second tip I'd like to share with you about camera techniques for street photography is to be comfortable with your camera settings and be confident to use them well. I prefer using manual mode. It's how I've grown up as a photographer. I'm very familiar with it, so for me it's not a problem. If you're not used to using manual mode, then aperture priority or program mode are going to probably be better options for doing street photography. Sometimes even shutter priority can be, depending on what style of photography that you're doing. But know your settings and be comfortable and be confident to use them. If you're not, if you'd like to explore with manual mode, just every time you go out, spend half an hour at least only using manual mode and getting a feel for it. And this way you'll build up your confidence, you'll build up your skill with it and become faster and be able to predict where your settings need to be. And this only really happens if you're using it. You're not going to get better if you don't try it. So be encouraged and try. I really believe that manual mode gives you the most control to be most creative with your photography. So another camera tip for helping you take better street photographs is to choose a higher ISO setting than you might normally do. Using a higher ISO, you're going to have a bit more flexibility with your aperture and your shutter speed settings. So you'll be able to use a narrower aperture setting and get a little bit more depth of field if you need it, or you can choose a faster shutter speed. And this is something I often find I need when I'm taking street photos. To freeze the movement, I'll need a faster shutter speed. So using a higher ISO is going to allow you to do that. So you can just have that bit of flexibility there. And with modern cameras, the technology's changed to a point now where most new cameras, or even slightly older cameras, they're not producing so much digital noise when you choose a higher ISO setting. So you don't really need to worry about that as much as we used to. So another tip for camera use when you're doing street photography is to be aware of your depth of field. A lot of photographers will like to use a narrow aperture, so it's really easy to focus. So if you're photographing people passing in the street, for example, and you are set at f/16 with, say, a 35mm lens, you're going to get a reasonably good depth of field, so you don't have to worry so much if your focus is a little bit out. But this isn't always going to produce the most interesting pictures. It might make life easier for you, it might make focusing easier for you, but easy is not always good. So when you're taking street photos, consider the depth of field carefully. What's going to suit your subject the best? What's going to really enhance your composition the most? A deep depth of field or a shallower depth of field? And another camera tip for street photography is using live view. So turning your live view on the back of your camera and using your monitor to compose. And if you've got a flip out monitor, if you've got an articulated monitor, you can use your camera at waist level or off to the side. You can pretend like you're looking and reviewing your photos rather than taking photos, so that if people are aware of you with your camera, you can just play act a little bit and make it look like you're not taking photos, that you're just reviewing, and therefore they will not be so concerned, they will not be so mindful of what you're doing. They won't think that you may be taking photos of them. So use your live view, make good use of it. It's a great tool. So the last tip I'd like to share with you about camera techniques for street photography is to experiment, try different things. Use a slower shutter speed. Look for somewhere to put your camera and line it up, and then just wait for the action using maybe 1/8 of a second. You're going to get some nice motion blur with people walking. If you're photographing traffic, you won't need to use such a slow shutter speed, but just mix it up and experiment. Remember that the shutter speed that you choose in relation to the speed of the movement that you're photographing will alter the amount of blur that you're getting. So experiment and find the best shutter speed to use to get the right amount of movement for whatever you're photographing. And then maybe try panning with the movement so that your subject stays reasonably sharp and your background blurs. Use some filters, try a graduated filter, try a polarizing filter if you've got these things. They're small and easy to carry with you. And yeah, just play. Experiment with flash, even the pop-up flash on your camera. Sometimes just popping in a little bit of extra light can make a big difference. Don't stick to the same methods that you always use or your favorite ones all the time. Push yourself to try new things. Your creativity will be more expressive when you're outside your comfort zone quite often. So just try these things out and you'll get a bigger variety and a more interesting variety of images each time you go out to take street photos. So I hope these tips have been helpful to you. and that you'll be able to put some of them into good practice. If you've enjoyed this video, please give us a like so that we know you've liked it. And if you're new to our channel, don't forget to subscribe. And if there's any other tips that you would like to offer about camera techniques for street photography, you can leave these in the comments below. Thanks for watching.